Hi, I'm Michelle Pilley, the MD and publisher of Hay House UK. I'm extraordinarily happy to be speaking to Meggan Watterson today. Meggan is a feminist theologian with a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a Master of Divinity from Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University. Some serious qualifications there from Meggan. She's also the author of several books and a facilitator of the Wonderful Red Ladies, a community of radical love that lets her preach about female saints, mystics, gurus, and poets, all the women who inspire us to live in service of love. Meggan, welcome. Lovely to be speaking to you today. You've written this extraordinary and powerful book that all of us who are honored to know you believe this was the book that you were born to write. What were the fears that held you back from putting the words down on paper?
Well, this gospel, the Gospel of Mary, was essentially buried around 367 AD and has been buried and silent and unconscious essentially since 367 AD. It wasn't found until 1896, and then it wasn't published until 1955. So to write about something that has been so seriously silenced in our collective consciousness and, you know, in our perception of Christianity, to have that level of silencing, it was literally the most difficult and the most visceral thing to confront was that silencing. So there was that, confronting that, and then there's the silencing that we do to ourselves, the judgment, you know, that it's not going to be good enough, that I won't be able to translate the amount of passion and conviction and devotion I have for this gospel, that I just wouldn't be able to do it. So that silencing, which is a judgment that we all do, but silencing myself was probably the most difficult thing to get over. And what ultimately I think helped me was understanding that all is about the ego. The ego hates dying. And one of the wonderful things about the Gospel of Mary is that it suggests that we want to resurrect in this life, in this body, right? We don't want to wait until we actually physically die to resurrect. We want to resurrect within this body now, again and again and again. The ego hates to die. And so when I got to the place where I could tell the truth, it was because I understood that this was all part of the process of the ego dying, you know, to who I had been before, and to, you know, really understanding that the deepest fear was the fear of the woman I had to become in order to tell this truth. You know, we fear being that powerful. We fear being that fulfilled, that aligned with the truth inside of us. And so once I understood that it's an aspect of the ego, it's not the true self, I was able to finally start writing.
That's a big win, my goodness. Yeah, an extraordinary journey that you've been on. I think in the book, you so beautifully talk about the now historically accepted facts that the Gospels, as you mentioned before, were selected. So Mary's Gospel and the Gospel of Thomas were written before or contemporaneously with Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. And a conscious decision was made not to include those Gospels in the canon. Could you explain how that happened?
So the Christianity that existed before the 4th century was a radical band of very persecuted people. They were people lovers who believed that Christ's main message was that there is no hierarchy. There is no hierarchy to existence. Like, we can't rate each other and ourselves according to some hierarchy that's based on our body, our class, our color, our position, our nationality, our citizenship. So you know, the Roman structure was very ingrained in terms of all of that status. And one of the main messages of that early form of Christianity was this idea that we're all created equal, that we are all equally an aspect of the divine, and it's a radical love that makes the first the last and the last the first. That it stood that Roman hierarchy on its head. So what happened was they were this, you know, crazy band of rebels, and they were deeply persecuted by the Romans after Christ's crucifixion. And there are some amazing stories of those early Christians that we have, like Thecla and Perpetua, which I write about in Mary Magdalene
It's
Revealed.
beautiful. It's fantastic, yeah.
Just powerful testaments to that idea that, you know, we are all, the message is to love each other, and that we are all equal. We're brothers and sisters in this Christ awareness. And so what ended up happening was in 313, Emperor Constantine, by a single edict, he transformed that persecuted and very radical form of Christianity into a state religion that was then redefined by men. So up until that point, women had been a part of the ministry. Women had always been a part of Christianity because the whole point was that we were equal. We were meant to be equal, and we were displaying that, you know, that the soul is what matters more than the body that the soul is within. So, and we are to be known by that soul that we are, and not just this human body. And so what ended up happening was during what was called the Council of Nicaea. So by 325, that was the first council was pulled together, and the creed of the Christian faith was hammered out, and it was decided that men there would be a male apostolic transmission, you know, from the Pope to the bishops to the cardinals, like it would go, and slowly but surely, women were edited out of the scriptures that were accepted as the canon, you know, which we have now. And then all of those sacred texts that had been considered Christian texts that contradicted that idea that men would have power, you know, prime, like the only power. So gospels like the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which date all the way back to 70 AD, which is proof of a woman who was as much an apostle and a minister as Paul was. You know, she was a minister alongside him. So the Acts of Paul and Thecla was taken out, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but then also, as you mentioned, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip. And the Gospel of Philip in particular named Mary Magdalene as Christ's companion. So if they were going to redefine women's positions, it wouldn't work to have her as his companion. And it wouldn't work to have her as this leader who was a partner really with Christ. So all of those texts, that's when that edict went out then in 367 for all of those sacred scriptures that contradicted this new version of Christianity that was more aligned with what already existed within the Roman hierarchy. So it was a way for Christianity to, you know, in a way, become a part of that hierarchy and really reinstate it and reinstitute it. And so that's when all of those other texts that tell a very different story, that's when they were buried. They were supposed to all be destroyed, but gratefully there were rebel monks who buried them in the deserts in Egypt and hid them in caves. So we have them today.
I think we're super grateful to those monks, to those brave guys who did that. It's no, incredible. that obviously the implication of that action, of that decision for women on their understanding of spirituality and religion was enormous. Could you describe what you feel that impact has been?
Well, you know, to have that visualization, that external visualization of that there is a male and a masculine version of the divine, an embodiment of it, and then a female and a feminine embodiment of the divine. To lose that is to then create this idea that the female, and especially the female body, is somehow less than, less divine, more human. And one of my favorite passages from the Gospel of Thomas, which is just a bunch of sayings of Christ. Christ says, I am what comes from what is undivided. So it's this idea of, you know, what ended up happening was this great divide where men and even God and the idea of the divine is somewhere up here and beyond and higher. And then women in the body and the earth and just even that we're human, that becomes lower and something beneath. It's divided, right? And there's like a ranking. And so I think this has been pervasive in our culture in ways that it's really hard to even understand the way we have internalized it, and the way that then we question ourselves, we question our own worth, which I think is really significant, because that's a word that comes at the end of Mary's gospel, which struck me when I first read it, that worth is brought up in Mary's defense, because she was asked at the beginning of her gospel by Peter to talk about things that she knows that they don't, because she was more loved than any other woman by Christ. And so most of her gospel is her speaking these hidden truths, you know, these things that she knew that they didn't, because of this unique love that Christ and Mary shared. And then at the end of it, Peter questions everything and says, you know, how could Christ give her, a woman? Because again, woman was considered below, but within the Roman hierarchy, women had as much rights as a slave. And so Peter couldn't understand, how could he give her, this lower being, you know, these secret teachings? And the whole point is that that was a part of the teaching, was that she was equal to them. There was no, you know, there was no separation. There was no division. They were one. And so I think, you know, to be able to have that idea of worth, Levi comes to her defense and he says, if the Savior considered her worthy, who are we to disregard her? And so that, like, I got such tremendous chills when I first read that, because I think that is the most significant way that we've been impacted, is this understanding of our worth, and that our worth is actually intrinsic. And it's not something we have to earn or prove. Our worth is, you know, we are all worthy, no matter what form we are in and take. We are all worthy of such a connection to the divine.
Thank you. And I know that whole attempt to diminish her, obviously, is absolutely embodied by the way that she's been described as a prostitute for so long. And I thought it remarkable, and I wasn't aware of this, that you mentioned in your book that Pope Francis has just said that is not correct. It's historically not the right information. And she was, in fact, the apostle of the apostles. I mean, that's extraordinary to actually try and, you know, shift that perspective. So, yeah, can you speak about that and what the impact of that as you see it? So.
Yeah, it's you know, for me, I think there's been something really powerful for women who read about Mary Magdalene or know about Mary Magdalene. There have been many of us who have validated it for ourselves. We've known that she was something so much more, radical than a prostitute. We've known that sounds a bit too familiar, there's the mother, the virgin, and the maiden, the whore. It seemed too familiar to be true, and something that many of us actually experience in our lifetime, that dichotomy of having to be one or the other, or think of ourselves as one of the other. So there have been many of us who are devoted to the Magdalene and have studied Mary Magdalene. We've always known she was something so much more than that. Yeah. But to have that external validation is really powerful, and to have that restoration of her true character, the possibility for that opening of a deeper understanding and a deeper healing, because the church formally apologized in 1969, but it has not reached the popular consciousness, and it's still preached in the pulpit, everywhere, that she's the prostitute, and she still isn't recognized and acknowledged for the role that she plays at Easter, for that resurrection story. She's still this side character rather than this she really was the first to witness, and to be able to witness him. And so, we have a long way to go, but for me, that was the beginning of, this opening, this external acknowledgement of what many of us have already recognized and know within us.
Yeah. And the Mary that how would you describe the Mary that all your research and years of research, study and meditation have remembered or re-understood? Could you describe her?
So the passage that I would say almost converted me. I don't know how to, and I don't know to what, because the Christianity I believe in isn't necessarily practiced outside of me. Like I can't walk into a church that recognizes Mary and that I experience her. But the passage that gripped me and became an obsession, really a passion for me, that has led to this book is a passage from chapter 7 of Mary's Gospel, where Mary is asking Christ, when I see you in a vision, how is it that I'm seeing you? Like, with what aspect of my physical being? Like, how is it that someone can receive a vision? With what aperture? And Christ starts by saying how wonderful it is that she can see him at all, that she has the capacity to be able to receive from within her. So there's that acknowledgement of how wonderful. And he says, there where the mind is, there is the treasure. But the word for mind in Greek is nous. And so that word nous, N-O-U-S, in Greek, I became obsessed with. And when I researched it, I realized that it really means heart. It's the spiritual eye of the heart. Because in Greek, this is pre-Descartes. So this is before the idea of a division of mind and heart. So to translate it into English as mind is very limited. That's not, real translation is the spiritual eye of the heart, that we can actually see and receive. We can perceive from within the heart. That to me is Mary Magdalene. She was the embodiment of that capacity that we have, while human, while very much embodied, that we can reach a state where we have entered the heart so fully that we can hear and receive love, messages, support, visions from within the heart. And that is it's such a revolutionary idea, right? Because then no one outside of us can tell us what's true for us. No one outside of us can take love from us. No one outside of us ultimately has power over us. Because if we can see with the eye of the heart from within us, then that's something that is simply within ourselves, and it's between us and the divine. So that's Mary to me.
Yeah. I was going to ask you why she's been so important to you in your life, but I think you've just answered that very beautifully. I mean, what an empowerment, what an incredible freeing vision to actually be able to embody that and to hold that with your absolute personal sovereignty and integrity. So because she has been your guide right throughout your life, hasn't she, in terms of when you first met her, she's been by your side or in your heart that whole time.
Yeah, I like to say that I have no idea how this is my life, but what I can say honestly is that I've never, there's never been a moment where I didn't know that this is what I'm here for, and that you know, I've been led by something, I guess, that is beyond me ultimately. I've been guided in ways like when I first went to her, where her legend extends after the resurrection to the south of France, this little seaside village called Sainte Marie de la Mer. When I first went there, I was on a pilgrimage to the Black Madonna. I didn't even know that was Sainte Marie de la Mer, and I was in my early 20s, and you know, that was when I first heard about her cave in the south of France, and that she had lived out the remaining years of her life there. And it's just, every time I would hear a story about her, or I would arrive at a place where I realized I was meant to be, right? So I was standing there in the south of France hearing about her cave, and such a mystery ultimately, how, you know, this, I'm this Midwestern girl raised in a very secular feminist family and wants nothing to do with religion. And I am obsessed and guided by something that made it so that every aspect of my life, no matter where I went or what I thought I was doing, always led to Mary Magdalene, to some aspect of her story, like as if our stories were interwoven. And that I really couldn't understand myself without also understanding her.
Yeah. And obviously to understand her, understanding her relationship to Christ is essential. Right. How would you describe that relationship?
So I like to say that it was extraordinary and it was exceptional. There was a unique relationship that existed between them, that it didn't exist with any of the other apostles and didn't exist with any other woman. So I'm not as concerned. There are a lot of people who like to ask and to approach me, you know, were they actually married? Were they, you know, lovers? I've never been concerned with that aspect of it. What seems unmistakable when you do include these other scriptures that were buried and censored out of the original canon, when you include them, you begin to see that Mary didn't just happen to be at the tomb, you know, in the dark, the only one there. That she didn't just happen to be at the right place at the right time. This is something that they had prepared for all along. This was something that was an aspect of his ministry that she completed, she fulfilled.
Right.
So there was something absolutely exceptional about their relationship. And in the Gospel of Philip, as I mentioned, in Greek, the word is koinonos, and it means companion. It means partner. Yeah. So she was his companion. And that to me is a very important aspect that I wanted to communicate in Mary Magdalene Revealed, is that we have forgotten that Christ was in love with Mary. You know, we have forgotten that aspect of his personhood, of who he was, because he was fully human and fully divine. But he was in love with Mary. And that's a very important aspect that we don't practice and that we haven't remembered. And to me, it illuminates even the canon that exists now. It illuminates it. It allows us to understand a story that is unfolding that we really haven't paid attention to, a love story.
Yeah. And understanding that, and through her, your vision of Christ has changed in terms of your understanding of him. But
yes, I can definitely say I was scared of Christianity. I had a very strong aversion to Christianity, and my mom didn't know what to do with me, so she had me go to the most liberal church she could find. And
right.
But my encounter with the traditional New Testament was to break out into hives. I mean, I was deeply disturbed by this version of Christianity. And I was just a little girl. So again, that's part of the mystery. It's like, how did I have a sense that this was incomplete? I don't know, but I have met many other people who had that same deep knowing and that same deep intuition that, that Jesus that was being presented to me in church and that I've seen and witnessed in other churches, that is a Jesus that's filled with judgment, and a Jesus that has like a very narrow door with which you can pass through in order to receive his love. It didn't make any sense to what I experienced. And so, I did away with it altogether. I didn't know what else to do, but, and studying other religions really helped me slowly inch my way back to Christianity, to the point where then I knew I had to go to seminary. I knew I had to figure out why I had such a passionate aversion to that idea of Jesus. And it was because there was a Christ that existed for me before church. There was an innate understanding of what Christ might be. But for me, Mary was my way to that experience. Mary Magdalene's gospel and her vision of Christ was the one that I understood and that resonated with me. And then once that happens inside of you, you often begin to meet those that also hold that same truth. The more we can tell the truth about ourselves, the more we meet other people who have awoken, to that same, to the same ideas. And so that began to happen. I began to meet more and more people but it was something I kept in the closet. It was definitely something not everyone knew about me, that really, this has all been for me about getting to this truth of what Christ, the experience of Christ is. So not just the character of Jesus was, but the experience of what Christ is.
And that, the commitment that you showed, not just you could have been revolted and chose not to go further, but to go to seminary and actually to embed yourself in Christian theology was a remarkable decision to understand that, and really extraordinary. And obviously, I'm aware that many Christians will find your book challenging, but many others, like you're saying, will feel an incredible sense of relief, of understanding and remembrance from the words, and extremely grateful for what you've done. But how do you find yourself handling situations when you encounter fundamentalists or people who are very upset at what you were saying? Well,
one of the deepest lessons I've learned, which is, how we started the conversation, is the view of the ego, the egoic identity, which is so loud and so present and so much a part of what it means to be human, is that we're attached and we over-identify at times with our ego. And what was so disarming and such a relief about Mary's gospel is that the meat of it, really the heart of her gospel, reads almost like an ingredients label to being human. She lists all of these powers of the ego, these 7 powers that we all possess and that are a part of what it means to be human. And we all at different points really identify with one of those powers, like ignorance or anger. And so, you know, getting to the point where I could write about her gospel, I really had to go through that practice of becoming really over-identified with one of those powers, you know, like anger. I really, really went through anger in a way that I had never had before. But what I learned to do was to practice this ancient experience of, it's called self-emptying love. And it's a part of all of these gospels that were excluded as well. And it's not just this idea of Christianity, it's the actual practice of it, the spiritual practice of it. And what it is essentially is just becoming aware when you're in one of those moments where you are completely identified with your anger, say, for example. And that's the realm of the power of wrath is one of the most all-consuming, right? And so it's being in that moment, becoming aware of, oh, okay, I am completely identified. My ego right now is completely identified with this anger. And then just emptying yourself completely of your ego. It's just, so it's self-empty love. It's just allowing yourself to completely empty. So it's not that then anger never returns. It's that each time it does, it's another opportunity to practice remembering that you're not just that ego, you know, that is so identified with it. You're also a soul that is only love. So it's practicing that again and again. And so when I am addressed by someone who is in a place that is very much entrenched in fear or rage or darkness or ignorance. Ignorance is an incredible power that Mary's gospel addresses. I try not to respond with my ego, because I know that is coming from a place of ego and will only bind me further, you know, to that. So I try to practice that sense of this is, you know, so it allows for compassion and empathy, because this is something I do too. You know, whatever that response is that's coming at me, I may not, you know, do that in that particular way, but it's a human aspect of all of our realities. And so I just allow those moments to be opportunities to practice that self-emptying love, and just to recognize, you know, that they're coming from their ego, and it would probably best if I didn't respond from mine.
Good way of putting it. You mentioned, as you know, before, I think there's so many of us, and I would count myself among the women or people that felt as a child a very visceral difference between the Christ I knew and the Jesus I heard described at Sunday school, in church, and the religious lessons that we had at school as well. Embracing Mary and being freed up to embrace the Christ that we have experienced at that heart level. What do you think this is going to open up out into the world?
I don't know. I know what I hope, or I know what I've experienced. Is a greater capacity to forgive myself. I think we've had this misunderstanding because of that division that I talked about, that being human is somehow sinful. Being human is somehow, you know, like we're deficient and we're unworthy of moments of grace, or we're unworthy of unconditional love, or we're, you know, and this message, this Christ, is that the whole point is to be human. There is no such thing as sin. This is something that Christ says in Mary's gospel. The only sin is when we forget that we're also a soul. We so identify with being the ego that we forget we're also a soul. And I think my hope is that we can have more patience and compassion and forgiveness for ourselves when we get in those moments, you know, of ignorance and anger and darkness. And we can understand that this is just an aspect of what it means to be human. And we can learn, you know, not perfectly and not permanently, but with time, we can learn to get back to remembering this other aspect of what it means to be human, which is to be love and to know that we are love. And we are a soul within a body that is meant to have an ego. If I didn't have an ego, I wouldn't have shown up on time or dressed. You know, we need an ego. We need an ego. We just don't want to be guided by it. We don't want that to be what is leading us and deciding our lives and our choices for us. We want to be able to remember the soul. And I think that's my deepest source of purpose has always come when I see someone being able to actually experience love within them, not love coming from acceptance or from anything outside of them, any source outside of them. It's this absolutely radical, revolutionary idea that love seeps out from within us and is within us, you know, because that's remembering the soul in those moments. That's the experience of the soul. And this is what we have missed out by not having Mary's gospel, is that we have believed that there are these gatekeepers, or there are these mile markers, there are these things external to us that then allow us to experience that love. Without Mary's gospel, we don't have that ancient dialogue that she had with Christ about how is it that I'm receiving you from within me. So not just outside of me or from something outside of me. This is something that happens from within. And that would be my deepest hope, is that there are more experiences of that for people, especially people who haven't had that experience of love, haven't known love, or have thought that love was going to come from something outside of them. That would be my hope.
That's a beautiful place to stop today. Thank you so much, Meggan. And I hope that our conversation today will excite people enough to read this phenomenal book. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.